Okay, well, welcome to this video where I'm going to try and show you how falsifiability works and how the logic of it operates and how it informs the way that we think about statistics and the way that we do statistics. Okay, now understanding the logic behind falsifiability isn't incredibly complex, so I'm going to use an example to try and illustrate how it works. So let's say we start off with a statement saying that swans are white. Now, how are we going to convince people that our statement is true? Now, one way to try and convince people that our statement is true is to keep on trying to find instances in which it is verified. So in other words, with a statement that swans are white, we just keep on looking for white swans. And every time we find another white swan, we say, hey, you see what I was saying is true, because here's yet another white swan. And so we build up more and more and more and more instances of white swans. And because we have a lot of examples of our statement, we say that our statement is probably true. And so this is trying to convince people by looking for confirmatory evidence, or at least evidence that confirms my statement. So with this confirmatory approach, the more instances that I have, the more I kind of confirm my theory. So all I have to do is to collect up more and more instances of my statement or instances of my theory, and my theory will become more and more convincing. But now there's another way of trying to convince people that my statement is a good one. So instead of, if I say that all swans are white and look for white swans to confirm my statement, I say that all swans are white and I look for any examples of non-white swans. That's a different way of doing it. So here what I'm looking for is actually any example that I can find that shows that my statement is false. See, so that's quite different from looking for confirmatory evidence, where I'm just looking for examples that confirm my statement. Now I'm actively looking for examples that would disconfirm it, falsify it, or refute it, or whatever you want to call it. So it's a very different kind of approach. I'm actively looking for anything that would prove that I'm wrong. So in my example, I might, instead of looking for white swans, I might look for a black swan. Now, if I do it this way, then I'm not looking for a situation in which more confirming evidence is equal to a more convincing theory. Instead, I'm looking for a situation or set up a situation in which the absence of falsifying evidence means a more convincing theory or statement. So if I make a statement, and despite looking for evidence that would falsify it, I can't find any evidence, that means that my theory starts looking more and more convincing, because despite my best efforts, I can't find anything to show that my statement is false. So that's why here we can say that the absence of falsifying evidence means a more convincing theory in this way of looking at things. We can think of some of the non-falsifiable mindsets that people may adopt as being really problematic. I mean, we can think, especially as psychotherapists, as people that are delusional. Delusional people will often maintain the delusion irrespective of any evidence to the contrary. When dealing with delusional people, there's often nothing that you can actually say to convince them that they're wrong. And often even faced with a lot of evidence to the contrary, they persist in just looking at confirmatory evidence. With that in mind, Karl Popper said that if we are uncritical, we shall always find what we want. We shall look for and find confirmations, and we shall look away from and not see whatever might be dangerous to our pet theories. Going to falsify our beliefs, says Karl Popper here, then there's a real danger that we're just going to be looking for evidence that props up our false beliefs. And as psychotherapists, we can think of an instance of neurosis. Let's say neurotic clients look for evidence that confirms a neurosis, and they deny or look away from evidence that would override their neurosis. Example of a client who perhaps, let's say, is suffering from delusions of jealousy, just looks for any evidence that confirms that. That is, that their partner is cheating on them and so on. But if they were to adopt Popper's view and to actually look for evidence that refutes their beliefs or falsifying evidence, their delusion wouldn't last very long. But there's other kind of context in which this non-falsifiability causes problems. With fanaticism, you often find fanatics will only see evidence that confirms their beliefs and not look at any other evidence. And even a lot of the modernist theories, things like Marxism and even psychoanalysis, we can't think of a way to actually falsify, or where we would even start trying to falsify these theories. And in the most extreme cases, these theories even take evidence to the contrary and modify the theory rather than refute the theory. So they just stretch the theory a bit further to fit in any evidence to the contrary. So when we're doing statistics, we stick to this philosophy of falsifiability because we want to be scientific. We don't try and just look for evidence that supports our theory. We're actually looking for evidence that refutes our theory. So we're using the falsifiability understanding. So when we're doing statistics, we're always putting on our hypothesis, which is our statement, and then we've always got the opposite of it. So using the swan example, we'd have something like all swans are white, and then we'd have the opposite, which says all swans are not white. So we actually clearly indicate what the falsifying data would be. And how this is set out is that we have an alternative hypothesis, which is the new something that we're looking for. And then we have the null hypothesis, which is the way things are, that there's nothing new. So the current state of affairs, in our example, all swans are white. That would be our null hypothesis. And we would say when we look at our data, if all swans are white, then we wouldn't find anything new. So that's the null hypothesis. Nothing new, nothing to see here. Everything's the same as it's always been. That's a null hypothesis. Then we have an alternative hypothesis, which is exactly showing what would refute that, or what would falsify that. That is that there is somehow a non-white swan. We might indicate the color, I don't know, but there's a non-white swan. And that would mean that we found something new. And we can see that if we find a non-white swan, then our statement that swans are white cannot be true. So we could refute it. Now, in the world of statistics, we're always kind of putting the null hypothesis, that is, that things are the way that they've always been, on the test. And so what we do with the data is that we look inside the data, and if we don't find anything new inside the data, that is, if we don't find what the alternative hypothesis prescribes, and in our example that there's a non-white swan, if we don't find anything new like that, then we say that there's a failure to reject the null hypothesis. So in other words, the null hypothesis we accept as being the reality of things, because we didn't find any data that falsifies or rejects it. If we do find new data, then we say that we reject the null hypothesis, and then we can say that we accept the alternative hypothesis, so we can say that we found something new. Notice, because of falsifiability, we never say that the null hypothesis is true, because we never know that possibly in the future we might find something that rejects the null hypothesis. Well, I hope you found this video on falsifiability to be enlightening and useful, and I'll see you in the next episode. So what I found interesting about looking at Popper's notion in the falsifiability talk related to the fact that if we just have a confirmatory way of looking at things and understanding our data, then we're going to completely just continue to confirm our theories and statements, and that only under a falsifiability type of narrative will we be able to find data that contradicts our assumptions and our statements, and thereby move our thinking forward. That statement in a way reminded me of the depth psychologists who make a similar point with the psyche, notably Freud and Jung, who basically say something similar by saying that we have to make the unconscious conscious, and that if we don't and we just labor under our assumptions and never question them or never take, in a sense, contrary evidence into account from the unconscious, then we won't make any progress as human beings. So it's almost, I was thinking it's kind of like Popper was suggesting a kind of like a similar process for kind of quantitative hypotheses. Popper had an idea of like a quantitative version of psychotherapy, in a sense. That is that we an idea of a quantitative version of psychotherapy that is almost like a psychotherapy for our data, in which we have to make the refutable, become aware of the refutable and the contrary within data in order to move thinking forward, and how that maps onto the depth psychologists' understanding that we should become aware of the unconscious and negative data within the unconscious. So it's an interesting parallel.